Horton and Sunderland South. I will get there in the end and remember it first time round. Bridget, thanks for joining me today and coming in.
No, thanks for having me in the studio.
I frequently on this programme talk about education, whether it's early years, whether it's access to the right school for your child, a school near enough to your home for your child, whether it's to do with exams, the COVID sort of hangover that education clearly still has. There's a huge amount that people will want to talk to you about, so it's great to have you here. Can I just grab a few minutes before we do that, though? And let me start with the story that's been in the news this week about Keir Starmer saying he will, in Labour's manifesto in the next election, retain Jeremy Corbyn's policy of scrapping charitable status for private schools. Why does that feel so important?
So Labour's position is that we will end the tax benefits that private schools enjoy because we want to put that money into delivering a brilliant state education for every child. So with that £1.7 billion we could raise, that gives you 6,500 new teachers in our state schools, better mental health support for our children. And we know that, mental health concerns around children and young people is a growing issue. But also it would allow us to make sure that all children and young people get access to really high quality careers guidance and work experience too.
And why has Labour concluded, and presumably you've looked into this, why has Labour concluded that the advantage, people seek advantage for their own children in all kinds of ways, and this is one way. Why have you concluded that the advantage is so significant that it needs to be taken away in this instance? It's described as spiteful by some opponents of it.
I know that parents want the best for their children. I want the best for my children. I want the best for every child in our country. But I do just think it's unjustifiable to continue with those kinds of tax benefits when we know there is real pressure on the public finances. I mean, that has been made considerably worse because the Conservatives have crashed the economy. But I think this is an easy choice that the government should be making. I see no good reason why Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have decided not to press ahead with this because, they tell us that, money's tight. Well, let's raise some money and then put that into our brilliant state schools and make sure that we can deliver really high standards for all of our children. I mean, this is 93% of children are in state schools. And if I were Education Secretary, they'd be my priority.
And, I mean, it may be that somebody, I'm about to give you a sort of example parent, it may be that kind of parent rings in the next 45 minutes. But if a parent who isn't rich is making sacrifices in order to send their child to a decent, or a recommended private school because they're not convinced about the local comp or the local whatever, the academy schools, whatever, and they feel like you're taking away an opportunity for their child, what would you say to them?
This is about delivering excellence for everyone. I believe really strongly that we need to have high standards in all of our state schools. I've got big aspirations and, big ambitions for all of our children. But if we're to do that, then we have to make sure that our state schools are getting the resources they need. I won't criticise individual parents for the choices that they make. I know they'll want the best for their children. But I'm afraid I just don't think it's right that private schools enjoy those tax benefits when I hear from many, I visit schools around the country and I hear from head teachers and from school leaders that they're facing impossible choices about whether they're going to have to lose teaching assistants, about whether they can afford school trips, whether they can buy even the basics for their children at their school. When confronted with that, I don't think we can continue to see a situation where private schools enjoy, nearly £2 billion of tax benefits.
And let me ask you about standards, moving on from that one. Let me ask you about standards, because we know that in parts of the Northeast and we know that in the Midlands and in some parts of the Northwest, the educational attainment of children has been dropping. We know that there is a bit of a postcode lottery around some education. What's your diagnosis of that before we talk about what the prescription for it might be?
I think it is, first of all, important just to recognise there is a real challenge there. This is something that I've been pressing the government on for a long time, long before I took on this role as Shadow Education Secretary, because we do see real gaps opening up. I think a part of it is around how we make sure that schools that are facing the biggest and most challenging of circumstances are where we support new head teachers to come forward. And we're seeing a growing problem about, teachers who are at that level below not willing to step up to headship. I think part of that...
And do we know why?
I think, it's obviously a job that comes with enormous responsibility. It's of course, it's an incredibly responsible job right at the heart of our communities. But when I speak to teachers and heads around the country, they feel that in recent years, the government hasn't been on their side, hasn't valued and recognised the work that they do. And I do recognise that work, and I want to make sure that we do deliver high standards for every child, but that has to be working with the brilliant people in our schools. But I won't I won't settle for anything else other than the best for our children. And that matters most for kids in areas where there are the biggest challenges.
And in those areas, and you get in your great head teachers, let's just say, is it about pupil funding as well? I mean, we've had recent, well, I'm going back to the early summer now, but Conservatives insisting that the right funding level and the changes to the pupil funding formula means that those most in need will get extra funding, will get the right funding. Are you satisfied that that's true?
Well, when you look at the research that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have done on this, actually it's the schools that face the biggest challenges that in the most deprived communities that have lost most over the last decade. I think that is completely wrong. We know they're under real pressure, because it's not just what goes on within schools. I speak to teachers and support staff who are going really above and beyond, but they're having to contend with a wider society in which families are under enormous pressure. Children arriving at school hungry, parents who are, skipping meals in order to make sure their children
and
don't
crime
go
in some cases as well is an issue, isn't it?
And crime's on the rise.
Inevitably for schools, that will be something they pick up if kids are in high crime areas or brought into county lines. It's a mess, isn't it, for parents, or it's a massive problem for parents and for schools. Is that something that would be part of your remit if you were Education Secretary? Do you think,
it cuts across government, but I think that's why there are a number of areas affecting children and young people where you do need to see a consistent approach across government. That's one area I don't think we've had enough concerted effort around that. The same is true, of course, where it comes to issues affecting children with special educational needs and disabilities.
Yeah.
Again, a real concern for lots of parents.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every time we talk about it on the programme, time and again, I mean, you'll know as well as I do that there are too many children with special educational needs who are not getting their statutory education at all.
Absolutely.
Because there isn't provision for them. Well, if callers don't ask you about it, we'll return to that one definitely this hour. Let me get some calls on for you because they are coming in already. Michael has called from Pontefract. Hi, Michael. What did you want to ask Bridget Phillipson?
Hi, Sheila. First of all, I want to say that I am that parent, Sheila, that you referred to just a moment ago. I'm slightly concerned about this VAT on private schools because not every private school is Eton or Winchester and has their reserves. Quite a few parents at the private school my daughter attends make quite a lot of sacrifice to send them there because the state system around where I am isn't up to scratch. Quite a few have special educational needs that simply cannot be catered for in state school. They've been in state school, they've not been catered for at all, so then move them into the private sector. Now, my question is quite simple. What is the plan for private schools such as that are not Eton, that aren't attended exclusively by the massively wealthy elite?
Do you recognise the distinction, Bridget Phillipson?
I do. Of course there are differences. And, I understand the point that you're making, Michael, and I understand that you want the best for your child, but I do just have to fundamentally disagree where it comes to those tax benefits. I think there are a lot that many schools could do to reduce their fees. Over the last 20 years, year on year, every single year, fees in private schools have been going up. The number of children attending has been broadly flat. So it's not clear that fees necessarily feed into demand that's there. But I would expect that private schools would do what they could to cut costs to parents. And I'm sure that there are ways that they could cut costs. At the moment, everyone's having to think about how they make quite difficult choices. And politics is about choices. And for me, this is a choice I'm afraid we do have to make.
Michael?
Because the other thing then is, if certain parents can't afford it, what happens? They take them out, they go into the state sector that can't cater for them. I'll be honest with you, Bridget, to my mind, it's the right idea, but the wrong way around. The state sector should be the priority to get that up to scratch so that there is a need for a private education system because it's up to scratch and can cater for all these children's needs. And I did speak to Angela Rainey about this some time ago, and she gave an undertaking at that point that there would be an initiative to prioritise the state sector first. Because what I'm sure what you don't want to do is to have people going into a state sector that can't cater for them. That's not up to,
well, that already happens, sadly, Michael. Was special educational needs the reason you sent your child to a private school?
No. I'm fortunate in that my ex-partner works there. So and we sent our daughter there simply because the state sector wasn't up to scratch at all.
I mean, the state sector not being up to scratch is the very thing I imagine, Bridget Phillipson, you're saying we want to fix the areas, the parts of it that aren't up to scratch.
Absolutely. And, all of the evidence points to the single biggest factor in delivering a brilliant education is making sure you've got a well-supported, brilliant teacher in the classroom. And by ending the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, we could deliver more teachers into our classrooms. And I think that will make a big impact on state education. But I completely agree, we're not where we ought to be. And my priority would be to make sure that we deliver a really, really high quality state education for every child. But that does involve making choices about how we fund it.
OK, so thank you, Michael, for your call. Susan's called from Tottenham. Hi, Susan.
Hi, I'm just going to take it one step extreme, and I would say just ban them. Only 7% of the population go to private school. These are people who have, material wealth. They've got cultural capital. If we look at the number of judges, 90% are from private, public school backgrounds. If we look at the number of consultants, society should be meritocratic, and private schools get rid of meritocracy. If you're having a race and one person has got a 10-second head start, how is it ever fair? How is somebody from a state school ever going to compete? It's not fair. It's not right.
So why isn't Labour banning them is your question, yeah? You want to go further?
Susan, because I believe that parents should have the choice, but I don't think there should be tax benefits arising out of that choice. We pay VAT, for example, on childcare. That's VAT rateable, whereas private school fees aren't. So I think you do have that inbuilt unfairness in the system. I think your point, however, Susan, around the need to make sure we have better representation in every walk of life is right. I think the balance is wrong where it comes to the media, the judiciary, still politics as well. Lots of people who've been privately educated. And, I went to a great state school in the northeast of England. I feel very passionately about delivering a brilliant state education for all of our children, but we do still need to break down those barriers that still exist around access to many of those kind of top professions that you describe.
And how do you think you go about doing that? Because, we're speaking on the day that a miner's daughter from County Durham has just become the Chancellor of my old uni, Durham University. Big fan of the North East, by the way, even though I can't pronounce the word Horton and Sunderland South. That's a great day. That's a great day, isn't it? It's a great day for the country, a great day for Durham, a great day for her. A bit jealous, dream job. So these things do happen. I've sat throughout my career in the same newsrooms as people who went to private schools, including Eton, Harrow, probably Rodine at some point in the BBC over those years. But, so it doesn't always mean you don't get good jobs, you don't get opportunities. So do you think it means that often enough to try to break that down via the school system?
You do have to work doubly hard, I think, if you haven't had those kinds of that kind of privilege in life. And people do make it through. And I was able to go from my state school to Oxford, and I feel very fortunate. I was really well supported by the teachers in my school. And Fiona Hill's an example of someone who's gone on to do amazing things. And her book on this, we could have a long conversation about how you break down some of these barriers. But her book on that, I think, talks about some of the practical steps and the responsibility that all of us have if we've been able to break down some of those barriers to make sure that we support the next generation coming through as well. I think there is a wider issue for government around fairness within our society overall, around equality and social justice. But we do, each of us, have a part to play. And I think Fiona Hill is someone who, as an individual, is doing an awful lot to try and demonstrate that, you shouldn't be held back by virtue of your background and you should aim high.
She talked about how her accent was commented on all the time, didn't she? Yeah. Well, it's great that she's got that job, even though I am a bit jealous. It's 17 minutes past 3. More of your calls with the Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson in just a moment.
This is LBC. It's Shelagh Fogarty on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary and Labour MP for Horton and Sunderland South, is with me in the studio to take your calls. Gemma has called from Rochford. So far, our two calls I think we've had so far have been about the private schools policy that Keir Starmer and Labour have announced. Gemma, I think you wanted to talk as well about special educational needs.
Yes, I mean, my child was in a private school and he was in there purely because he had additional needs, but we weren't able to find a suitable placement in time for him and he needed a much smaller class. Once the placement at the private school was no longer working, we've since in 11 months had no school place at all. So it's almost like that was our only option, and if those options aren't available to parents who maybe aren't affluent, then how are the people with special educational needs supposed to access any education at all when they're just it's broken? So
when you read this story or heard this story about Keir Starmer saying he'd retain that policy of scrapping charity status, you immediately, your mind, it sounds like to me like your mind immediately went to, oh no, the school will close, I won't have that option. That's not what your intention isn't that these schools close.
Not for specialist provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities. But I do recognise the point that you're making more widely, Gemma, because the system that we have right now isn't supporting children properly, and I hear time and again about the lack of suitable placements, and the battles that parents are having just to get what should be a basic right for their child in terms of
and often it becomes a legal battle.
Why aren't MPs and people like yourself, why aren't they prioritising that? Why are they looking at issues like this rather than other more pressing issues in the education system like special educational needs?
Reforming the special educational needs system would be a big priority for the next Labour government. I can absolutely assure you of that.
And that work
Gemma.
is happening, is it?
It is. I mean, at the moment, where we are in terms of the government's approach is that they published a green paper on this earlier in the year. They've now pushed back their response to it into next year, which I think is really disappointing because I don't think parents can wait for the support.
Kids don't have that time.
They don't. You only get one chance at these things. And we do need to reform the system overall. It's too adversarial. Children wait for far too long. And I think we also need to do much more to identify additional needs much earlier, because if we get that support put in place as early as possible, it can make a big impact as well.
And Gemma, what was missing when you were looking at the state sector that you now get in the private sector for your child?
The small classes. So, for example, my child was in a small class of 11 children, and in a mainstream school that would have been closer to 30. And it just isn't something he can manage. There had 2 teachers within that classroom, so he could have a lot more one-on-one support that he couldn't access in a mainstream school.
And did you find shortages in the state school? In the state sector?
Yeah, so it was widespread. There wasn't really any schools that I could find that had small classes and the right kind of support.
What will Labour do then, Bridget Phillipson? And you say that the reform plan is in the pipeline and being discussed, but workforce shortages are everywhere. And when it comes to special educational needs in particular, you need the teacher, but you need a team around the teacher with some children. You certainly need extra hands on deck with most children with special educational needs. Are they there, those people, trainable, ready? Is there a plan for that from Labour?
I think where it comes to right across education, but including in our schools, we will bring forward further plans around workforce, because you can't deliver any change without a brilliant workforce. But it is around support staff that schools are telling me they're having the biggest difficulty sometimes in recruiting.
Yeah.
And it's often
teaching assistants, people who'll sit and read with a child who needs more attention with their reading, things like that.
Absolutely. But I think there is also a need to make sure that people doing that really important work get the recognition and the kind of career progression that is more closely aligned to the teaching profession too. So it's really important work, but increasingly people, school support staff are themselves, having to turn to food banks or having to take on second jobs because of the cost of living pressures that are there.
And on workforce, we've had some standout comments from Keir Starmer recently about immigration into this country. He focused a bit on the NHS, but it applies to most sectors. Where is this? You might have a workforce plan, but where's the workforce going to come from? Are you identifying those areas where these people are who can be either trained up or moved into these roles?
I'd say two things. So firstly, there are a lot of people currently out of work, not able to take part in the workplace because often of health conditions. We have long NHS waiting lists.
Caring duties comes through a lot on this programme.
Caring duties, cost of childcare for many women in particular, and it does tend to be women who would like the opportunity to work, potentially with more flexible hours and where they can better line up work and family life. That increasingly, women are increasingly giving up work because of the cost of childcare. But I think alongside it, it's also about skills too. So making sure that we're supporting people to retrain in later life. There are lots of people who I know would really welcome the opportunity to a bit later on in their career to go and work in a school, to train and become a teaching assistant. But those kind of routes to doing that it's increasingly difficult.
Well, you've said a lot in that answer, haven't you? A huge amount of political work resides in that answer you've just given me there, and I wonder the degree to which that work is being done. And imagine you win the next election, how quickly you could start to see the fruits of it, because you've got there carers who are caring for perhaps sick or elderly people, carers who are parents, women mostly who are leaving the workforce or not enjoying as much of the workforce as they might because of access to childcare. You've got skills systems that would need to be either improved upon or created. That's a huge amount of political work, isn't it?
It is, and that's what we're working on right now. I'm keen that if we win the next election, we've got that plan to get going as quickly as possible to make the change that our country desperately needs. But some of it absolutely will take time. The scale of the challenge in terms of what that next Labour government would likely inherit means that some of this will take time. But part of the problem, I think, that affects our politics at the moment is that we've got a government that's been very focused on the short term, and many of the challenges we face in education and in wider society are about having a longer term plan for how you make change. Well, so it's both together. But if you don't have a longer term plan, you'll just constantly have these sticking plasters, and that's what we're saying right now from this government.
And to have half a chance of building that plan, enacting that plan, having the time to put that plan into practice, Labour's going to have to do some serious political work between now and not just the general election, but let's imagine you win that one, beyond, so that you get another term at least to continue that work, because these are generational struggles you're talking about here. Once a child who's Gemma's child now, 2 years before the election, maybe 2 years before it starts getting up and running this plan and starts to really be fruitful, that's 4 more years. And children are in and out of the education system in the blink of an eye, really, aren't they, and can be missing out.
And that's why it's so frustrating to be in opposition, because I look to the challenges that are there. It's clear that there are ways in which we could address it and make life better for people. But yes, it will absolutely take time. But then my frustration is also that we have a government right now that have had 12 years. That's a very long time to make change. And whether it's the state of our schools, and I have increasing reports about the condition of many of our schools, around access to childcare, which is getting worse for many parents.
Which I'll talk about more after 3:30.
And for special educational needs
sure.
too. 12 years is a long time to get that right.
Well, Catherine's called from Muswell Hill. She wants to talk about university level education, a specific element. Catherine, hi.
Hello there, hi. Yeah, I wanted to ask Bridget about university education, and particularly post-COVID, what Labour has in mind with regards to regulating how university students are taught, what proportion, if any, of their lectures and teaching, tutorials, etc., are still delivered online, which for many universities is still the case. And that seems to be something that's been completely abandoned post-COVID. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
I think it will vary institution to institution. Of course, universities are independent, and that's as it should be. So I don't think it's always necessary. I don't think it's for politicians to micromanage the detail of that. I think it will very much depend on the nature of the course, the kind of study, and some hybrid models can work very well. In other cases, face-to-face is absolutely essential. So I do think it's hard to comment in the generality. It will very much vary from course to course.
And Catherine, do you ask that question because of a particular experience yourself?
Yeah, I asked that question for I've got children at university. One of whom is recently graduated, another of whom is still at university. My husband works in a university, and his working pattern has changed enormously post-COVID. And you're right, it has been left for the universities to essentially work it out themselves. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, the university's minister, who was at the time Michelle Donnellan, said, she actually came to the university where my husband works and said she was going to try and liaise with universities to create some guidance, some modelling, essentially some guidance to have some uniformity of delivery and standards. But I'm a little bit, I suppose, concerned to hear that your approach is, well, we'll let the universities decide for themselves. Because at the end of the day, if universities are businesses, they'll do it the way they can afford to do it, the cheapest way. And that does not ensure a high standard of education for the next generation. It just doesn't.
Will you be looking at that, or maybe you already are, looking at the degree to which online learning, which can be a real boon for people who perhaps are doing that they work or are doing post-work studies and that kind of thing, being able to do it online if you have kids or you have a full-time job, really useful. But the student experience of being at university is about much more than the academic, isn't it? It's about the social, and by that I don't necessarily mean drinking social. I mean just the meeting of people, the meeting of minds, I guess.
Yes, and I suppose that's why I'm making the point that institutions are different, because they will often have different students in terms of background and what they need. So, my local university in Sunderland has quite a big number of mature students who are combining work and study. And many of them say that they find it quite beneficial to be able to take part in or to watch back lectures, to do things online, to balance, often where they've got children, to balance that. But yes, where it comes to younger people, often they will want that experience of being on campus, of being with others, and from kind of sharing ideas, from discussing. And I do really feel for young people who went through particularly those lockdown years and through that COVID period, because it was tough for everybody. But I think for many of our young people, particularly those at university or starting university during all of that,
an isolating time, wasn't it? Yeah.
And we know that there is growing worry around young people and mental health and their loneliness and social isolation. But I do I visit lots of universities. I speak to staff there.
And
they are trying to get this balance right.
You think it needs to be a balance of the two?
Yeah, and
hybrid essentially.
And some young people who might be commuter students, they're living in their hometown, travelling in every day to university. What some universities have told me is that they struggle sometimes to get young people onto campus. It's not simply that they're denying young people the opportunity to go there. Some of that's cost of living related, because the cost of travel is going up. But sometimes it's that young people themselves might find it's a better balance. But yes, there is something that comes of, being with your peers, discussing ideas together.
A lot of money for that degree. You want real teaching time, don't you, and a focus on what you're doing.
And using the facilities that are there, because obviously many, universities will often have brilliant sports facilities, libraries and much more besides. But I do think it's a balance, and it will really depend kind of on the mix of students within an institution.
Well, Catherine, thanks very much for your question. More questions for Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Education Secretary, who's with us on LBC, taking your calls, Labour MP for Horton and Sunderland South. Lots of texts coming in as well. I'll put some of those questions to you too. It's 3:33. Let's get the headlines from Amelia Cox.
New estimates suggest 20 people may have died as a result of an error at a COVID lab. The mistake meant 39,000 positive cases were reported as negative, mostly in the southwest of England. The new Sizewell C nuclear power plant in Suffolk is getting the go-ahead with a £700 million government investment. Ministers claim it will create 10,000 highly skilled jobs and power the equivalent of 6 million homes. And the Foreign Secretary has summoned China's ambassador following the arrest of a journalist covering anti-lockdown protests in Shanghai. Edward Lawrence was also allegedly beaten during the demonstrations. LBC weather: mist and fog lingering in central and eastern England this afternoon. Brighter elsewhere with plenty of sunshine in the north. Staying largely dry, a high of 11 degrees.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. LBC with Shelagh Fogarty.
A quick text here from Callum. We'll talk to Gary in Manchester in a moment. Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Education Secretary, is in the studio with me to take your calls and questions by text as well. Callum asks an important one, I think. What is Labour's plan to protect theatre and the arts within education? Because there's been an awful lot of complaints over the last, I don't know how many years, it comes through a lot on the programme, that those things like sport and the arts and drama are being sidelined in education. Is that what you see happening?
I am concerned that it's being squeezed out, music, sport, art, drama. And, my worry is that increasingly it's only parents that can afford some of that, can afford to pay for the extras. It's only those children that are getting access. And I think that all children should have access to a rounded, full education that does include the richness of life, of music and sport.
Well, those things you
drama.
mentioned are the joy, aren't they? I mean, I was taught by Salesian nuns, never knowingly without a guitar. And they were, it was a school full of singing and acting. And, you didn't always take part in every element of it, but it's the joyous bits, isn't it?
It is, and I don't see how, I think it's more than possible to deliver a really strong education and making sure that all young children in particular get a grounding in the basics, while making sure you also have a rounded and balanced education alongside that too. I think it's just incredibly important for all of us and for right throughout our lives as well.
And it gives confidence as well, doesn't it, to kids who maybe might not take it beyond the school doors, but it can create a confidence in them when they take part.
Absolutely, I think it's really important.
Gary's call from Manchester. Hello, Gary. What did you want to ask Bridget Phillipson?
Hello, Sheila. Thank you for taking the call. Hello, Minister. I'm just wondering if you're talking the talk, but can you walk the walk? Because what my point is that the north-south divide is that every child up in the north is only getting about £5,000 per head. And in the south, it's like £7,000 per head. How do you expect to get excellence and good results with that in mind, and plus class sizes?
Yeah, Gary, I agree with the point that you're making. And, in education and actually right across public services, we've seen money moved away from communities that often face the greatest need or have the greatest demand on those services and pushed into areas where there is more affluence and you don't have those same pressures. And as I was saying earlier with Shelagh, we have ended up with a system and a funding model that means that money has been moved away from more deprived communities, those schools serving more deprived communities, into more affluent areas. And I don't think that is right. Under the last Labour government, we made sure that we drove up standards everywhere, but there was also a real focus on making sure that those schools facing some of the biggest challenges were given the support that they needed.
Will there be, for example, a new school funding formula from Labour if you win power?
I think we need to review the system that we've got right now. It's clear to me that it's not working. I mean, I can't, I'll be honest, I can't set out the specifics around what that would look like right now, but I don't think the system we've got works, and I think it has to change, and it has to run alongside, however, a real push on making sure we've got, we're dealing with some of these teacher shortages too, but that are particularly acute at a secondary level in some of those subjects. We're just saying there on technology and maths and physics, for example, that it's often in parts of the north in particular where we're facing a real struggle to recruit into those subject specialisms, and that has a massive impact on children's ability to do well in school.
And again, it's more than a shame; it's a crying shame, because those areas that we've talked about, the northeast, the northwest, the Midlands, historically brilliant educational institutions in those places as well.
Absolutely, and why education is a real passion for me, and why I think it matters, is that it can just completely transform someone's life chances by getting a brilliant education. School can't correct every problem in wider society, and that's why you do have to have a more a wider infrastructure.
It can enable.
It can change lives. And it can be, and particularly if we get it right when children are younger, we can make sure that they're set for life.
I mean, I would comment, if I may, on your exchange with Gary there. And Gary, do feel free to come in again. Gary wants an answer. He wants to know, is a child in Manchester going to have the same funding as a child in London? And if not, why not? And, I get that politicians can't always... Thanks, Gary. I'm glad I got that right. I get that politicians can't always describe and define full policy in interviews like this, in conversations like this. But you're going to need to soon. And, at some point and before the election, people are going to need to know if you want them to hang their hat on that Labour peg, they're going to need reasons why. And you're going to need to be able to answer those questions.
I understand that. I suppose what I would also say is that we do, you look at the state of the public finances and, we had that disastrous mini budget. We've had 12 years where our economy hasn't been growing. We're still potentially 2 years out from a general election. We don't quite know how bad things are really going to be ahead of that time. So I don't want to make promises right now that I can't keep. But what I can say to you, Gary, is that I absolutely agree that particularly in those areas where children face some of the biggest challenges, where education would really transform their life, it will be my mission to make sure that schools in those communities are given what they need to succeed, and that our children in places like Manchester and in Sunderland, where I'm an MP, because, it's about fairness for me. It's about children having a real and genuine chance to thrive. And at the minute, too many children are held back because of where they're born and their family background. And I think that is what I came into politics to change. That's why I'm sat here talking to you today about that.
Does that reassure you, Gary?
Not at the moment, because I'm seeing that the class sizes are actually rising in my area. I'm not going to blame immigration, but that's where it's falling down as well, because they're going to have to teach these young kids that are coming in from Albania or wherever, and they're going to neglect the other kids that are in there. But
Gary,
as well.
some of the immigration is bringing you much needed teachers as well. Don't forget that.
I totally agree with you. In my field as well, we've lost a lot of drivers, and age is against us, and et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's the little kids that it's their futures, and if they're going to they're not going to get the support that they need, then they're going to grow up to be dummies.
Well, I doubt that with you in charge, at least in your house, Gary. Thanks very much indeed, Gary, in Manchester. Before you go, Bridget Phillipson, I'll continue to take calls from people and what they've heard and what they want from Labour. But the early years, preschool years, is something I know you've written about, you've spoken about, you made something of an announcement about it in the Labour conference this year. But it's such a huge problem, isn't it? Because, as you said earlier, it's keeping women out of work and it's just breaking families' finances.
This is massive, and it does keep women out, in particular, out of work. But it also means that so many children are arriving at school, particularly children from more disadvantaged backgrounds, are arriving at school already months behind their more affluent peers. And if you look at that attainment gap that we see, so much of it opens up when children are very young. So I think we need to do what's right by children to give them the best possible chance in life, but also to do a lot more to support parents and families.
And again, how? I mean, you've got government ministers standing up in the Commons promising 33 hours a week. What they don't say is that right from the beginning, I'm telling you stuff right from the beginning of that announcement, the sector itself said we can't afford it with this amount of money. It's going to land on the wealthier parents, the costs for this, or we're going to close, or we can only provide for X number of kids instead of Y number of kids. What's Labour's offer going to be that's markedly different and better than that?
You're right, the government did knowingly underfund that 30 hours offer, and that has caused real pressure. It means that lots of parents are paying above the odds.
Well, and nurseries are closing. Absolutely.
Availability of early years childcare is increasingly a real worry. But it's for that reason that I'm determined that we get this right, and that when we make...
How? People are going to want to know how.
Absolutely. So what I set out at Labour Party conference is that we will build a modern childcare system from the end of parental leave, when many parents will return to work, right through to the end of primary school. And the first step towards that will be delivering breakfast clubs for every primary school child in England, which I think would be a massive help to parents who really struggle around, particularly in drop off in the morning. And
age 4.
Yes, from age 4. But the early years part of that preschool, I think, is also really important. That's where we will have more to say.
That has to be transformed, doesn't it?
The current system, we spend a lot of money as a country on this, and yet it still costs parents a fortune. It still sees women in particular giving up jobs they love because childcare is so expensive and unavailable.
I hear it constantly on this programme.
And it's fragmented. So it's how we bring that system together. But again, returning to workforce, we need to make sure that we drive up standards as well, and that we see people better supported for the incredibly important work that they do. They don't have, many our staff working in early years don't have a voice in the way that our teachers would with their.
Could it be brought into the
unions.
education system proper? Is that thinking going on?
I think we need to reimagine all of that. So yes, I think that part of the system, the early years part, needs to be thought of as part of a much wider education
Infant
system.
education.
I was over in Estonia last month, and they've got a system around that. So from the end of parental leave, you have a guarantee of a childcare place, and that is then regarded as part of the wider education system. I think we do need to look again at how we think about education as a country. So I think it's both that system, but also that education isn't something that ends
lifelong. Yeah.
Absolutely, it doesn't end when we have finished our formal education, whether that's in a college or a school. It should be throughout our lives. And with the shift that we're going to see in the economy, where it comes to transition around climate change, it's more important than ever that we give people opportunities to upskill throughout their lives.
Well, I look forward to hearing that reimagined early years education in more detail when the time is right. Thanks very much indeed for coming in today. It's been really good to get you speaking to our callers, because we've touched on lots of different issues there, but they come up all the time. Thank you very much. Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Education Secretary, Labour MP for Horton and Sunderland South. Got it right. It's 3:48.
Coming up at 4 on LBC, Ben Kentish.
For the first time ever, less than half of people in Britain say they're Christian. But is the UK's loss of religion a cause for celebration or concern?
Ben Kentish on LBC.